Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 285. I'm the host, Kyle Anslone. On today's show, I'm talking about the appeal that we won with YouTube and some of the censorship the show and myself have been facing over the past couple of months. And then I'll get into some news on North Korea, China, and Nigeria. So, a lot of important stuff to get through and cover on today's show. Be sure to share the show is hosted at the Libertarian Institute. No matter what, we will always be posting our episodes at the Libertarian Institute. And so that means you can also find the show on its own audio podcast feed as well as the Libertarian Institute podcast feed. You can subscribe to the video version of the show at Rumble, Odysee, or YouTube, and then you can follow me on Twitter at @KyleAnslone_. You could donate to the show at Patreon or Subscribestar, and we also accept crypto. You can donate that at the address is found in the show notes page. The last way to help out the show is by supporting our sponsor, Paloma Verde. PalomaVerdeCBD.com is the home to high quality CBD products. They have a lot of products at Paloma Verde, but I always get great feedback from listeners on their CBD dog treats. The co-host of the show, Connor Freeman, recommends them for his dog. I've also talked to other listeners who say they're great for helping their dog to either reduce the energy level a little bit or as they get older to ease some of the pain the dogs are feeling. So you got a dog, want to help improve their life a little bit, check out the CBD treats that they have over at Paloma Verde. PalomaVerdeCBD.com, promo code PEACE. All right, let's get into the episode, and I want to start off talking about the strike that we received from YouTube last Friday, and this was on show episode number 55, saying, is Trump plotting a coup in the United States or in a regime change in Iran? And this came out in 2021, I believe in either February or January of that year. Now, when this initially happened, because we already have a warning on the page, we were suspended from YouTube for a week, but were able to submit an appeal. And so the last time that we got a warning was over a year ago, was June 1st, 2021. And that episode was titled The Cult of Blue Anon. Keith Knight, my colleague at the Libertarian Institute, was the guest. And we talked about a variety of things. And they claimed that there was violence in the episode, and the only place where we even joke about something like that was around Joe Biden's comments towards a journalist. If you remember, he was in like an F-150 or something like that, and somebody was asking him about Israel's bombing of Gaza, and he made a joke about running over the journalist, and so we joked about that just a little bit. And we, myself and the co-host of the show, Will Porter, spent a lot of time crafting an appeal. We listened to the whole episode several times to figure out, how we should frame things and, what we should say to YouTube to get this warning taken down. And YouTube never addressed the appeal. We never got a response on it, or anything like that. And then we were hit with this second strike, or I guess the first strike. The first one was a warning, and this time I kind of just immediately reacted. I didn't even listen to the whole episode, to be honest. I knew what myself and Connor Freeman had said on episode 55, and I was fairly certain that there was no way we said anything that could even be classified by the censors as misinformation related to the election. Our position on that, we really never looked into any of the claims about ballot harvesting or vote somehow rigging the actual voting process. We always just didn't check into that. My initial feeling immediately after the election was there was no way that YouTube, that the Donald Trump administration was ever going to turn up the evidence, even if it did exist. And I was pretty doubtful that it did, that there was any one party that essentially rid the voting machines and were able to change the vote outcome of the election. And so for us to be hit with that really did make sense. Now, there were times where we talked about how the suppression of the Hunter Biden laptop story by the media and by the social media companies was significant. And then, of course, there's an article in Time magazine that literally describes an elite cabal that helped to engineer an election win for Joe Biden. And so that was, that's kind of the approach that we took on that issue on the show. But that was never anything that got anybody hit with misinformation. And so I immediately reacted. My comment and even the appeal was quite fiery. I said, this is absolutely absurd. If anybody listens to the episode, we actually said the opposite of what, we're claiming, the misinformation that you're claiming that we promoted. And it only took about an hour and a half, but they did take down the strike. They reinstated our account, so we're no longer suspended. This episode will be able to be posted on YouTube, which, great. And very surprising that the less articulate and I think well put together response got a faster, and obviously the only response that we got from YouTube, but we did win the appeal. So, this is cool. It doesn't happen to a lot of people, and I guess I am taking this as an opportunity to continue to direct the future of conflicts of interest away from YouTube. And so if you're listening on YouTube, and look, if you're dedicated to YouTube, you really like it for whatever reason, or you're just set in your ways and you're going to keep using YouTube, I'm not saying, stop doing that and go subscribe over on Odysee or Rumble. But if you're already listening to some content on those platforms, go ahead and make conflicts of interest a show you listen to over there as well, because we never know when we're going to have episodes taken down at this point. In this case, we actually said the opposite of what they claimed. We still had our episode taken down for several hours. Also, this was an old episode, over a year and a half old, and so the fact that this stuff is being taken down really seems like our content, and particularly myself, is being targeted for censorship. As I'm sure listeners of the show know, at the beginning of May, my Facebook account was given a permaban, absolutely nuked, without any prior post being removed or flags or any kind of warnings, suspensions, anything like that in the past from Facebook. And then, one day they just completely removed the account without any official communication on why that happened, and now the account's completely gone. Can't even type in the username or anything like that. And so I do worry that on these mainstream platforms, my days and the days of the show are numbered, and so I am looking for more ways to get off of these. Unlike with Facebook, though, for YouTube, I feel absolutely prepared. Rumble and Odysee are both fantastic and getting better all the time. I think the quality is starting to match that of YouTube, and honestly, I watch a lot of my shows over on one of those two platforms versus just staying on YouTube all the time. And if you guys could do the same for the show, it will help out, because the censorship is coming. Even if it's not for anything we actually did wrong, it doesn't seem like that's going to stop people from taking down our content. All right, let's move on and talk about first article today. This one I wrote at antiwar.com on June 5th. After U.S.-South Korea war games, North Korea to test flurry of missiles. The U.S. and South Korea wrapped up military drills involving a U.S. aircraft carrier. Following the war games, North Korea tested 8 missiles. Washington and Seoul responded to Pyongyang by conducting a series of missile launches. The 3-day exercises were led by the USS Ronald Reagan and included ships from the South Korean Navy. Joint U.S.-South Korean war games last included an aircraft carrier in November 2017. The naval operations took place off the coast of Japan. The war games occurred after President Joe Biden traveled to South Korea and met with newly inaugurated President Yoon. Biden and Yoon agreed to consider increasing the joint military drills between the U.S. and South Korea during that visit. It's unclear to me if these were carried out as is, or if these war games were actually a part of the agreement, or at least the escalation of the war games agreed to when Biden traveled to Seoul. Now, this isn't in the article, but something, another news story I want to mention. During that trip, I think at least two, but maybe three U.S. Secret Service agents were sent home for being drunk and assaulting people. So this is just interesting that the U.S. is again having problems with its the conduct of its Secret Service. But back to the article, tensions between the U.S. and North Korea have been increasing throughout 2022. The test was one of North Korea's largest, involving 8 short-range missiles. Pyongyang has now fired 31 missiles in 2022, surpassing the previous maximum for a year of only 24. The missiles were launched on Sundays from several areas of North Korea. According to South Korea's defense agency, the missiles flew at an altitude as high as 80 kilometers and traveled between 110 kilometers and 670 kilometers. At least one of the missiles flew in a various trajectories. Japan's defense minister said the missiles might have the ability to avoid defenses. On Monday morning, Seoul and Washington responded by firing 8 ground-to-ground missiles in the East Sea. The test was a response to North Korea's test the day before. Washington believes Pyongyang will soon test a nuclear weapon. North Korea has tested multiple strategic missiles in the past several months, including an intercontinental ballistic missile 2 weeks ago. And they also tested at the beginning of May a ballistic missile. And then since I wrote this article, the U.S. and South Korea have carried out another show of force, this time flying 20 warplanes near the North Korean, South Korean border, and so that was meant to be a show of force to Pyongyang. Now, of course, we have seen in the past with the Trump administration, Trump comes into office, takes a very aggressive stance against North Korea, and this ultimately provokes the country into carrying out a series of weapons tests and also greatly increasing rhetoric. And then eventually President Trump offered somewhat of an olive branch to North Korea, and this is what ultimately was able to de-escalate tensions between the two countries. And in 2018, we had the very successful, maybe the absolute height of U.S. and North Korean diplomacy with the Singapore summit agreements. North Korea starts to dismantle some of its weapon testing facilities, and things are on the right path. There's several meetings between North Korean Supreme Leader Kim Jong-un and South Korean leader Moon Jae-in, who I think deserves essentially all the credit for all the positive developments that occurred in the Trump administration. I think without President Moon in South Korea, there would have been no chance to facilitate the diplomacy between Washington and Pyongyang, and that is a significant difference now. There's far more of a hawk in President Yoon now in Seoul. So this doesn't look like a great situation. However, the Biden administration could quickly improve it by trying to negotiate with North Korea. However, this I think will be a repeated topic on this show. The Biden administration just isn't interested in diplomacy. It's absolutely absurd how this is played out, where you have the Biden administration coming in, and they're supposed to be the adults in the room who are going to de-escalate tensions around the world. And maybe he's improved relationships some with some of America's already closest allies, the UK and some of our Western and then Eastern European partners, not so much all the Central European partners, and then like Australia or Japan, maybe India a little bit. You say he's increased ties, but largely, Biden's continued to isolate America's position in the world by refusing to negotiate with anybody about anything. This includes Iran, where he could have saved the nuclear deal that his former boss Barack Obama put into place. Joe Biden was in the White House when this thing was established. Trump ruined it for no reason. All he had to do is get back into it, and has essentially refused to meet the most basic demands of the Iranians in order to make that happen. And so, now let's move on here and want to talk next about Joe Biden's inability to having diplomacy even in our own hemisphere, with the Mexican president now going to not attend the summit of the Americas hosted in the U.S. The U.S. basically said that we're not going to invite representatives from several governments, and the Mexican president responded by saying, well, if you're not going to invite everyone to this summit of the Americas, then it's really not a summit of the American countries, and so we're not going to attend. Or I guess, Mexico is sending a representative, but the president is not going to attend, so they're refusing a high-level business visit, and the Biden administration did not cave on this point. This conference is now going to take place without the leaders of, I don't know, it's maybe 20% of the Latin American countries. I guess maybe this is, maybe my math is off because there's more Caribbean countries that I'm taking into account for, but there are a lot of leaders of very significant and important American states who are no longer going to attend this summit because of the actions of the Biden administration. All right, so we'll move on now and talk about China news. It's been a while since I really talked about the U.S.-China relationship, not in relation to what's happening in Ukraine. And so I want to go through and talk about a few ways that this relationship is getting increasingly rocky. This from Dave DeCamp, June 2nd at antiwar.com. Beijing calls on U.S. troops to stop trade with Taiwan. On Thursday, trade talks with Taiwan. On Thursday, China called on the U.S. to stop trade talks with Taiwan after Washington and Taipei announced a new initiative aimed at increasing economic cooperation. The U.S. and Taiwan announced the initiative on Wednesday, which marked the formal start of trade negotiations. Taiwan's trade representative John Deng, the head to Washington next month for the talks, Deng said the initiative covers 11 areas, including trade facilitation, regulatory pricing, agriculture, anti-corruption, supporting small and medium-sized enterprises, digital trade, labor rights, the environment, standards, state-owned enterprises, and non-market practices and policies. The trade talks are the latest example of the U.S. taking steps to boost informal relations with Taiwan. Chinese Foreign Minister Zhao Lijian said that the U.S. should stop negotiating agreements with implications of sovereignty and official nature and refrain from sending any wrong signals to the Taiwan independent separatist forces. And I do think, this is something we have to consider, not just to, repeat the Chinese government talking point, but if the U.S. is emboldening the separatist ambitions and promoting Taiwanese, independence from Beijing, then you're promoting those parties and increasing that political movement in Taiwan, which will eventually lead to conflict with mainland China, something that you would hope the U.S. is interested in avoiding, but that really doesn't seem to be happening. The U.S. has plans to send more weapons to Taiwan. Senator Tammy Duckworth recently traveled to Taipei amid soaring tensions, and all this is provoking China to carry out military drills near Taiwan. This from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. The China's People's Liberation Army on Wednesday announced it would conduct a military exercise near Taiwan to send a message to the U.S. over its collusion with the island. Colonel Shi Yi, a spokesperson for the PLA's Eastern Theater Command, described the exercises as a solemn warning against recent collusion between the United States and Taiwan. It's hypocritical and futile for the United States to say one thing and do another on the Taiwan issue, and is frequently encouraging support for Taiwan's independent forces, she said. The drills came after President Biden first visited to Asia as president, where he said from Tokyo that the U.S. would intervene militarily if China invaded Taiwan. The comments initially appeared to be a break from U.S. policy of strategic ambiguity around Taiwan, but they were quickly walked back by the White House. Biden later clarified that there had been no change in the policy of strategic ambiguity, which means the U.S. won't commit to defending Taiwan, but whether he meant it or not, Biden's pledge to intervene in Taiwan was viewed as a major provocation by Beijing. Over the past few years, the U.S. has increased cooperation with Taiwan as part of its strategy to counter China. The relationship has angered Beijing, and Chinese officials have warned that Washington's support for Taiwan's independence forces could lead to a war between the U.S. and China. And, it definitely seems like we are increasingly walking down that path at a fast pace, especially with this Nets article I have from June 1st by Dave DeCamp. NATO's strategic concept document to add China as threat. Now, before I go into this, I know the strategic concept documents are boring as hell, and they're war plans for wars that will never happen and certainly never plan out like NATO wants. But when they're identifying China in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization's documents, when they're identifying China as a threat, that means they're going to start taking more actions that confront China, that are aggressive towards China, and it's going to increase the tensions between the U.S. and China. So Dave writes, Julianne Smith, the permanent U.S. representative to NATO, said Wednesday that the alliance will use its upcoming summit in Madrid to outline the new strategic concept document, which will include for the first time what NATO views as threats emanating from China. NATO releases a new strategic concept document about every 10 years. The last one was published in 2010 and did not mention China. Smith said that while the strategic concept will put a heavy emphasis on Russia, there is an appreciation across NATO that this document is not intended to last for a week. This document is supposed to last for 10 years. While China hasn't been named in NATO's previous strategic concept, the alliance has made clear that it has its sights on Beijing in recent years. In 2020, a report titled NATO 2030, the alliance said it would put focus on China by increasing cooperation with the Asia-Pacific nations, including Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and South Korea. At the summit in Brussels in June 2021, all 30 NATO leaders released a joint statement that said China poses a challenge to the so-called rules-based international order. Naturally, NATO's new focus on China has drawn a rebuke from Beijing, which has warned that the alliance needs to stay out of Asia. While the U.S. is focused on arming Ukraine to fight Russia, the Biden administration has said that its top foreign policy is still China. The Pentagon's new national defense strategy named Beijing as the top threat facing the U.S. military. And I think this is an important point that I want to make on this show, is just because we have focused so much, because so much of the current news is on what's happening in Ukraine and the tensions between the U.S. and Russia, that I don't think this means there's been an actual pivot in any way in U.S. strategy or long-term foreign policy, that they don't see the ultimate evil as being China that they're going to have to confront. Now, one of the major things going on, and one of the things I see to confirm this, is even with everything going on in Ukraine, the State Department is still very concerned of what's happening with some pretty insignificant Pacific Island nations. Remember, and I brought this up a lot, when Russia was invading Ukraine, Secretary of State Antony Blinken was not on the phone with Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, trying to defuse the invasion in any way. Rather, he was in the Solomon Islands trying to open an embassy. And so we've seen the U.S. now look to hold more relations with these Pacific Island nations, and we have China looking to counter this. Dave writes at antiwar.com, China has proposed a plan to 10 Pacific Island nations to expand economic and security cooperation, which the U.S. has expressed concern over. Beijing has submitted a draft deal, and the Chinese Foreign Minister Yang Yi will discuss the proposal during our tour of the Pacific over the next week. He will visit 7 countries China hopes to endorse the deal: Kiribati, Samoa, Fiji, Tonga, Vanuatu, Papua New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands, which recently signed a security pact with Beijing. Wayne will also hold virtual talks with the Cook Islands and the federal states of Micronesia, three other potential signatories to the deal known as the Common Development Vision. According to a leaked draft obtained by The Guardian, China has proposed a double trade by 2025 compared to 2018, provided additional COVID relief funds, send medical personnel to the islands, and offer government scholarships to the region. The security side of the agreement focuses on the training of police forces. The draft deal proposes to expand law enforcement cooperation, jointly combat transnational crime, and establish dialogue mechanism on law enforcement capacity and police cooperation. In response to China's plans, the U.S. State Department has accused Beijing of making shadowy deals. This is what Ned Price, the State Department spokesperson, said. "We are concerned about the reported agreement. It may be negotiated in a rush, non-transparent process." Price claims that China has a pattern of offering shadowy, vague deals with transparency or regional consultations in areas related to fishing, related to resource management, development, and assistance, and more recently, security practices. And if China is doing this, I wouldn't necessarily be surprised. I would, offer the additional information that I think is important to know, which is if they are, they're mirroring a lot of the U.S. trade policies and a lot of the ways the U.S. operates in the world. All right. Before I wrap up the show for today, I want to get to some good news and good news on Yemen. Two new good stories, good news stories on Yemen here. The first is that the ceasefire was extended by 2 months, and so it was supposed to expire June 2nd. I guess that means it will run now through August 2nd, and hopefully this will continue to allow trade to improve in Yemen and for resources to get to where they need to go. So many people in Yemen entering 2022 were facing famine conditions. The Saudis launched a blistering air war in January of this year, but after the Houthis fought back against that in April, I believe, April 2nd was the start of a ceasefire that has seen some improvement in Yemen for the first time in basically 7-8 years, which is huge. I believe the new ceasefire agreement is supposed to open up roads around the contested city of Taiz, which is, at least at the start of war, I think was Yemen's fourth largest city. I'm not sure, with all the internally displaced people, migrants coming to Yemen, if other cities are now larger, or maybe if this city has gotten even larger and it's now like the third biggest. A lot of people have changed where they're living in Yemen throughout the war. But relieving the blockade around this city would likely be huge to people who have, that city is their home. They've lived there for 8 years as this war has gone on. And essentially the battle lines haven't changed all that much around the city. The Houthis have had like a half moon-esque control, like cap around the northern half of the city, but from my understanding is for the rest of the time, or the rest of the area around the city is controlled by the Saudi-backed government. Now, the other news in this occurring in the U.S. is that Congress has introduced a new war powers resolution that would end the American support for the Saudi war here. And, if this gets passed, maybe Biden won't veto it like Trump did, and the U.S. would have to end its support for the Saudi war. The bad news is Biden's going to Saudi Arabia to kiss the ring of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, so it seems kind of unlikely that he's going to allow Congress, which is led by his party, to pass this bill. My guess is they would try to throw up a roadblock and just prevent it from being passed in the first place, but if he has to, he may veto it as well and continue to send weapons and support the Saudi war effort in Yemen. The Biden administration is pretty desperate at this point to try to increase the world oil supply, as prices in some places in the U.S. are creeping up on $10 a gallon. We saw the Biden administration allow Venezuela to ship oil through 2 European companies, I believe, to Italy and maybe Austria. It wasn't France wanted it, wasn't able to get it. And so, a little bit of sanctions relief coming to Venezuela, but not much overall. And with Biden going to Saudi Arabia, I think he's basically going to offer Saudi a freer hand to operate in Yemen in exchange for Saudi Arabia producing more oil. Yet to be seen, how the Saudis are going to feel about that. Now, then, let's see. I think that's about all I have. Other than if you can call up your congressman and particularly it's in the House right now and tell them to support the Yemen War Powers Bill. Getting this thing passed would be huge. And while the White House may try to throw up a roadblock, if there's already a lot of momentum in Congress, it may be harder to do. So this is something that we could really push to maybe end one of these wars. Last up, I just want to mention this, not the biggest story, but in my news roundup a couple days ago, it was being reported that there was a massacre at a church in Nigeria and that 50 people had been killed. This was reported by multiple sources, I think mostly local sources. That number has been revised down to 22. And so it almost never happens that I get to do this on the show, but to say that far less people died than expected. My guess is, so from all reports, what was initially reported that gunmen showed up at church and opened fire is correct, and the church was packed at the time. People must have either fled and went into hiding, or as people were leaving the church, they just assumed at least 50 people were killed based on the brutality of the action, but either by luck, chance, or the fact that maybe the people didn't have as sophisticated of weapons or as many like bullets that would have been required to kill 50 people. Less than half the number initially reported had actually died. So just wanted to take some time to mention that on the show and correct the news roundup there. I'll continue to report on this if there's any new developments, but my guess is it's just a part of the general ethnic violence that's been going on in Nigeria, largely since, and that's been exacerbated by the instability in the region caused from the U.S. war in Libya in 2011, overthrowing Gaddafi there, created a lot of instability in a lot of neighboring countries and essentially now in the entire Sahel region. All right, that's the show for today. Thanks, everybody, for listening. Be back with more shows later in the week. Connor Freeman, the co-host, returning, as well as antiwar.com's Dave DeCamp.